Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. My special guest is journalist Whitney Webb, who I have a lot of questions for. Whitney, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, a lot has happened since you were here last time. Oh my gosh. The Epstein situation has escalated to another level. I think I couldn't have even imagined. I want to pick your
Yeah.
brain about this. Donald Trump's administration basically, promised that they were going to release these Epstein files, and apparently, a lot of their supporters decided to hold them to that. Fast forward, Pam Bondi says that she has these files on her desk and it's a lot of information to go through, and you're going to get that information. Then you have a team of conservative influencers who come to the White House to retrieve these binders, and they're holding them up in the air, basically telling people, we got the Epstein list, we have the files. Information that came from that wasn't anything new to, I think, most of us, of course,
hmm
especially not you. Fast forward, Dan Bongino and Kash Patel go on to corporate media and they tell everyone, well, nope, there's nothing to see here, folks. What happened here?
Yeah.
What is happening? And why is Ghislaine Maxwell all of a sudden now being seen as a victim?
Okay. So the Ghislaine Maxwell thing, I should address separately. What you talked about, what you just brought up earlier, I think has been really extraordinary, not in the positive sense, but just kind of, I think most people have been kind of taken aback from it because what does the administration really gain here after promoting the releases, promoting the perception that they're going to release these files and have this unprecedented era of transparency and things like that. And then instead of doing that, do a very public 180 and just kind of hoped that the trust that some of these figures in government had, like Kash Patel and Don Bongino, having been prominent on the podcast circuit in the past, the trust they built with Trump's base, that being enough for them to kind of swallow this very obvious 180 in rhetoric about these documents and about a major aspect of the case in general that has been or a theory about Epstein's death in prison that has been heavily popularized or within Trump's base, which is Epstein didn't kill himself kind of stuff, and then they of course attached themselves to that and walked it back once in government and as the top two officials in the FBI. So yeah, what do they stand to gain from it? I don't think anyone really knows at this point because it's very, we have to be kind of speculative here because we're not going to get like an admission from the Trump administration about what they're actually thinking. They're obviously worried about PR and optics. And they have continued for months to kick this can down the road and try and make it go away after promising it so extensively. So one can't help but think, but there's things in the files that are inconvenient to either the administration, to Trump himself, or to people very close to Trump in his inner circle. And then that's why the documents are not being released for whatever reason. So, I started a series. Hopefully, the next part will be out next week. I have one installment of three out, sort of exploring some people in Trump's inner social circle going back a significant amount of time that could stand to lose some things if they may be in the documents based on publicly available open source evidence. And allegedly Trump has also been in the documents. But again, the Epstein story is so often they try and sift it into partisan boxes. So, Democrats, because of how badly this has been managed in terms of the PR optics side of it for Trump's base, have seemingly, smelled blood in the water and have tried to pounce on this and pushing to release the files and are now talking a lot about Epstein. Whereas during, the Biden administration or before that, they didn't really talk about Epstein very much at all, probably because Epstein had a relationship with prominent Democratic politicians, right? So it's it's kind of a mess, and it's hard to believe, some of these congressmen, for example, that have come out and said, Trump's name is in the documents and they were going to redact it. That's very well possible, but because of how partisan everything is, until we like see that evidence that they were redacted and all of that, it'll be hard to know. So again, I think at the end of the day, as I've said and maintained for years now, the Epstein case and scandal involves figures from both parties, especially in the wake of the Republican Party becoming very Trump-centric ever since 2015, 2016. And presumably it's problematic for this documentation to come out for some reason. But, again, we have to kind of speculate as to why that is, because this 180 has not really benefited the administration at all, unless there's something, most people aren't seeing. And it's also possible this 180 could have been planned for some purpose we don't know yet, but will reveal itself in time. So either way, it's all a mess. And it's hard to know what's going on, especially because, Trump has now taken the line that it's a Democrat engineered hoax, the whole Epstein scandal. And he didn't say that back in the first administration when Epstein was arrested and then died in prison when he was president the first time. Right. So why did none of that come up then? And why is it now a Democrat hoax? I mean, he was questioned about Epstein plenty when he was, in office the first time. And then, during the 2024 election, he did an interview with Tucker where Tucker asked him about Epstein. He didn't say it's a Democrat hoax. I mean, that's obviously a new line. So why is that being made now? And of course, there's a lot of, influencers that are, I guess, closer to Trump world than others that are very willing to, continue and promote this line of thinking. And then, other people in the online sphere have sort of taken it upon themselves to treat Ghislaine Maxwell as you pointed out, a victim, just as the Trump administration is moving to, they move her to a minimum security prison. Allegedly, she's been allowed into some sort of work release program. And it seems increasingly likely she's going to be pardoned in some capacity, which Trump has fielded publicly, both for her and for Diddy before his sentencing.
I don't think that would go over well with his base. Pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell for one, but to your other point, Diddy. I think a lot of them are going to have a problem with that particular one. Is it possible, if you were to make an assumption, is it possible that when you say it's bipartisan with Epstein, is it possible that it could be that even someone that's a part of Donald Trump's administration could also be in those files other than Donald Trump?
Yeah, well, the part 2 of my series is about someone who's in the Trump administration in an important role, but it's not talked about very much in the media, yeah, it's not good in terms of the Epstein, not just Epstein, but Maxwell and Jean-Luc Purnell connections of this person. And a lot of people have speculated, that since I said that I'm writing about someone in the current administration, that it's Howard Lutnick, who was Epstein's neighbor. I wrote about Lutnick like 2 or 3 times in 2024, including his Epstein stuff, before I guess it kind of percolated into the wider public discussion about him being Epstein's neighbor and who he purchased his house from and all this stuff. So it's not him, it's someone else. I'm kind of reticent to spill the beans before the article is out. But it could be very problematic for this particular person. And even though they're not so much in the public eye, what they're doing for Trump is important. And I think Trump would find it almost impossible to denounce this guy, because they've been so close for so long. So we'll see. But yeah, that's sort of the theory of this series I'm working on called First Friends, kind of like First Lady, like a pun on that, where it's basically like, here are a few people that are very close, that have close ties to Trump, and who also had close ties either to Epstein or some of the best known Epstein associates, like Brunel and Maxwell. And Brunel, not unlike Epstein, died in a French prison while awaiting trial in relation to the sex trafficking stuff.
From what I've gathered from your articles, this seems to be a global network that Epstein was a part of, and I believe there are multiple Epsteins. Like I don't believe that Jeffrey
Oh,
Epstein was the head of
absolutely.
the snake. Yeah, like they never go after the head of the snake. They never go
Well,
after
the
the
head
head.
of the snake, quote unquote, are just, it's the billionaire class. And so there's a faction of these billionaires in our oligarchy. And of course, the American oligarchy, the American oligarchs don't necessarily, a lot of them don't have an allegiance necessarily to the United States. They have an allegiance to their business interests, which are usually transnational, right? So these guys operate at a different level than than most people of the general public, to say the least. And they engage in a lot of shady activities, some of them, and they can afford to do that. There's actually a long-standing history of this in the United States, beginning with like the Rockefeller family in World War II, of some of these oligarch families basically creating their own private intelligence agencies that work for them. So it's complicated because I mean anyway, if you think of like US intelligence, who created the CIA, who was first in the CIA? Well, it was a lot of Wall Street bankers and lawyers. And a lot of, those guys had early ties to British intelligence and things like that. So there's kind of a transnational angle there. But there's a reason why a lot of the early, most well-known coups that the CIA did in other countries and regime change operations were done on behalf of U.S. multinational corporations. They're representing the interests of the oligarch class, and they're basically the secret police of that class and have acted that way for a very long time. And then I argue, of course, in my books that these interests merged with organized crime, and then the CIA sort of took on a lot of the rackets that used to be the mob's rackets, like drugs, prostitution, or sex trafficking, arms trafficking, things like that. Because once you combine that with, an entity like the CIA, it has state protection. And so you're not being investigated by governments. But you can use governments to go after your competition in the drug trade, in the arms trade, in the human trafficking trade, and you can be on top. And
Once
that's what I
again,
think ultimately the story is about.
yeah, it's like once again, it goes back to the billionaire class. Like every time, I always tell people follow the money. So speaking of that, the Diddy situation, I found your article about the Diddy Epstein connection. That was very, very interesting, and I read most of
Thanks.
that to my audience. And that I think kind of woke me up about the music industry in particular and the ties that they have, like Universal Music Group. We have pointed out that even someone like DJ Khaled, for example, who is Palestinian, had this connections to Universal Music Group, will not say anything about the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. And then when you look at the connections, it all makes sense. How long do you think there's been those ties within the music industry where there's Zionist ties there? You mentioned Clive Davis, who has been brought up, I think, numerous times over the years. People have
Sure.
questions about him. And then connecting all that to Diddy, after reading your article, it seems like Diddy was basically like a puppet of sorts when you look at the music industry and the ties that it has to Zionism.
Yeah, so basically the main companies I talk about in the piece are MCA, which later becomes Universal. Um, and then I guess CBS, which Clive Davis worked for some time before starting his own record label, Arista, which did that joint venture with Diddy's recording interests in the 90s. And so basically, MCA, Music Corporation of America, has longstanding ties to the Jewish mob in the United States. And so when I talked about the CIA getting in bed with organized crime interests. That organized crime interest in particular is sometimes referred to as the National Crime Syndicate. And this was sort of a meeting of the Jewish mob and Italian mafia through Mayor Lansky and his childhood friend, Charles Luciano, who was later deported to Italy and involved in some sort of a lot of interesting things there, like the nexus between CIA and Mussolini style fascism and organized crime and all sorts of stuff in Europe. But in terms of, the Lansky sphere, you have connections to people like Lou Wasserman, the longtime head of MCA, and other MCA affiliates. And also, MCA was involved in some intelligence linked operations, specifically the Promise software scandal of the 1980s, which involved a top MCA executive along with organized crime linked figures, CIA linked figures, and also involved in the Promise software scandal was Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, and the Israeli intelligence services, in addition to U.S. linked intelligence. And is a really crazy scandal that takes a long time to sort of sift through all the different aspects of it and understand. But a lot of it was about putting backdoors in software, but also it involved aspects of covert weapon development and biomedical experimentation, like gain of function kind of stuff. I mean, it was a very crazy thing. So why would MCA be involved in that? And then, MCA later was sold to the Bronfman family, who have organized crime ties that go back to really the rise of their dynasty. They're known as sort of they were once the top dogs of the liquor industry. This is because they were in Canada. They were sort of able to manipulate the situation with American prohibition and because it was legal in Canada when it was illegal in the US. So they were able to produce a lot of liquor and then have it bootlegged to the US across the US-Canada border, and made a lot of ties to organized crime who were involved in the smuggling of that liquor, particularly with some of these Jewish mob-linked figures. And that persisted with the Bronfman family since then. And the Bronfmans also have ties to, figures like Leslie Wexner. They co-created this billionaire study group, or the mega group, as they've called it, which a lot of the known members of it, because it's not like they publish a membership roster online. It was reported by the Wall Street Journal in the late 90s, some of the names of the billionaires that were part of it, and most of them have ties to organized crime, historically, if not currently, including Wexner. And so Edgar Bronfman Jr., whose name is in the Epstein Black Book, basically took over the music interests of Universal and thus MCA. And I haven't finished my series on Diddy Epstein stuff overlap, but basically Diddy gets very in bed with Bronfman Jr. in the early 2000s through Warner, which all gets folded into this Bronfman controlled aspect of the music industry. So it's pretty extensive, I would say, this particular, organized crime angle within the music industry. And a lot of my work shows that they relatively consistently overlap with intelligence.
You also talked about the gangster rap field in the hip hop music industry, and the connection to the prison industrial complex, where it seems as though there was a push for gangster rap in order to feed into the private prison system.
Yeah, so this was alleged by whistleblowers and some other sources that I note in the article, that seemingly there was an effort to engineer the rise of specific types of sort of to commandeer hip hop and its popularity in rap, and use it to try and basically cultural engineer urban youth to engage in crime for the purpose of filling private prisons. And so people have said in and out of the industry that this continues to today, and that some of the music industry, there's music industry overlap with the private prison industry. And yeah, as I noted in the article, there is an overlap there, as I mentioned earlier, with this shady behavior related to the Promise software scandal that top MCA figures were involved in. That it was also in that same network where the MCA guy was intimately involved Wackenhut, which I believe is now the Geo Group, like one of the biggest in the top two with Core Civic private prison companies in the US. And that was also true in the early 90s, including when the Clinton crime bill was passed, and Clinton was extremely close to MCA's head, Lou Wasserman. Very, very close. And also when Clinton was setting up his post-presidential philanthropies, being flown around on Jeffrey Epstein's jet to do so, he was joined by Lou Wasserman's grandson, Casey Wasserman, who that was brokered by Lou Wasserman, that introduction. And I'm if I remember correctly, Casey got involved with Clinton Foundation stuff and some of these other post-presidential philanthropies of Clinton. And I believe I this my memory isn't great because I have a little, or at least isn't as good as it normally is, because I have a little baby, number 3. But Casey Wasserman, I believe, is also in charge of rebuilding major aspects of Los Angeles after the fire and the LA Olympic Committee. He's like in charge of that, almost positive. So that's pretty weird.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
no one's really talked about that. I mean, a few people here and there on Twitter, but you think it would be a bigger story personally. But I mean, these are kind of people in a protected class. You don't really get to talk about all of these ties. Well, people do talk about it and can talk about it. I would like more people to talk about these figures that are still sort of influencing things and aren't so much in our face. But again, mainstream media and some of the bigger voices and independent or alternative media, this kind of stuff kind of doesn't really get a lot of coverage in people's Epstein stuff. Like I said earlier, it's so partisan. If you're in like the right wing sphere, it's like Epstein Clinton, and if you're in the left sphere, it's Epstein Trump. And it can get a little crazy at times and make it hard to understand sort of the broader significance of what's going on. And I think that was also true to an extent with some of the coverage of Diddy as well, because with these types of activities and accusations, people tend to focus on the salaciousness almost exclusively and not kind of the broader significance of what those salacious activities may have been in service to. Right.
Well said there. I agree with you. It is bipartisan. And that you mentioned the Clintons, and this is another question I wanted to ask you about. It was just announced recently that Bill and Hillary Clinton are being subpoenaed to testify
Yeah.
in reference to the Epstein files. And I've tried to explain to my audience, I don't think the Clintons are going to go to jail. I think they're also pretty protected as well. But to have them testify in person, who gains from this here?
Yeah, so like I just said, the way the media and the powers that be and whatever have tried to manage media coverage of the Epstein case is have it be like a partisan thing. And so the Trump administration is uncomfortable with a lot of the pressure they've gotten from their handling of the Epstein document release and the speculation that has provoked. Right. And so the best way for them to get away from people talking about the Epstein Trump relationship in ways that are uncomfortable is to move it to the other side, which, as I have said a few times, is the Epstein Clinton relationship. So basically, mainstream media, and I'm sure this will be the same line Congress takes, may only really talk about an Epstein Clinton relationship after Clinton was no longer president. So that would be the well-known trips that Epstein and Clinton, that Clinton took on Epstein's plane, like the trip to Africa, the trip to Asia. These were pretty much entirely associated with Clinton setting up his post-presidential philanthropies, like the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, and the Clinton Global Initiative, which Epstein's defense lawyers later claimed Epstein had a significant role in creating. And of course, the Clinton Foundation later on has ties to the Maxwell family. They inject $1 million plus into Ghislaine Maxwell's Terramar. Her nephew, Alexander Gerassi, works in the State Department under Hillary Clinton, and he had previously been a liaison between Isabel Maxwell's foundation and the Clinton Foundation. And Isabel Maxwell, of course, is Ghislaine's sister. So, who has a lot of ties to what she called her father's Rolodex. So, her father being Robert Maxwell, like a pretty well documented Israeli spy. And some of the figures in those Rolodex are figures like Ehud Barak and Shimon Peres, former prime ministers of Israel. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of interesting overlap there as it relates to, the Epstein Clinton relationship, but I doubt they'll go down the Israel line because we're talking about US Congress, and we're talking about the Trump administration, who are very affiliated with the current Israeli government for sure. We may see some stuff about Ehud Barak come out in that. I don't know, because Ehud Barak was one of the people that pressured Clinton to pardon Mark Rich, for example, at the sort of around the as he was leaving the presidency, and then later, not that long after, gets very publicly involved with Epstein, and also gets involved with Ron Burkle, who is probably best known for owning a bunch of supermarkets like Kroger, I believe, and he accompanied Clinton on one of these philanthropic development flights, but also ended up hiring Clinton not that long after that. And Burkle, of course, also has pretty significant ties to Diddy in the same period of time. And I think Michael Jackson as well. So a lot of, yeah, I know you think more people would talk about Ron Burkle, but they don't. It's strange. But anyway, this is all significant, I think, too, because I doubt there is going to be any serious discussion if the Clintons are brought to Congress to ask them about Epstein's 17 visits to the Clinton White House in the 90s. I doubt they will go there. And that's because one of the figures that Clinton was most often, or sorry, that Epstein was most often meeting with was a man named Mark Middleton, who worked in the White House. And Mark Middleton, after it was reported, I think first by the Daily Mail, the full extent of the meetings at the White House, and that Middleton was the main guy he was meeting with, died of a very honestly impossible suicide. And the images and forensic evidence collected at the scene of his death were sealed by a court like right after, so no one can look at it.
Speaking of, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say he was found at this property owned by this NGO called Heifer Ranch, hanging from a tree with a shotgun blast to the chest. Seems pretty improbable. And that was the same year that Jean-Luc Brunel died in prison. So there's like a lot of weird stuff here. And I sort of posit, well, not sort of, I do posit in my book reasons why Epstein would have been meeting with Middleton during this time, because Middleton was basically involved in the scandal that's remembered today as Chinagate, but it was really the second coming of Iran-Contra, I think. And Epstein at the time, through Leslie Wexner, had taken control of Southern Air Transport, it used to be owned by the CIA, and then it was indirectly owned by CIA people, and was the main airline of choice for Iran-Contra for smuggling drugs and arms and all sorts of things. And so when Leslie Wexner bought it, and at this point Epstein had power of attorney over all of Wexner's affairs and was basically running his portfolio, it moved from headquarters in Miami, where it was going to Latin America and back into, Mena, Arkansas, and all of that. Instead starts going from Columbus, Ohio, where Wexner is based, to Hong Kong. And what were they trafficking?
Right. I just saw something recently. It was a documentary about what happened to Abercrombie and Fitch. And there's a lot of focus on the former CEO there. And there was a connection there with him to Wexner. And it's interesting because it was just like, I think about a year ago, I covered where he was also arrested for sex trafficking, but he was released on bail. It seems like there's a connection here to the modeling industry as well. I noticed you wrote about Naomi Campbell and how she,
Yeah, I'll have a lot about that in my next piece. A lot about that. So I'd be happy to come back on and talk about it when it's out, because there is absolutely a lot going on here with the model industry, especially the John Casablanca's founded firm, Elite Model Management. And one of the people that I'll be writing about that's in the Trump administration right now is actually a protege of John Casablanca's, from my research, that got very involved with Trump in the 1990s. So there's a lot of very strange things going on around that, and sort of the elite hosted Look of the Year contests, which basically have teen girls. And a lot of the winners seem to marry older, wealthy men, like as soon as they're legal. Or, if you're John Casablancas, you marry them before you're legal by going to another country and tell people publicly that you like child women. That's a quote. It's messed up,
Oh
to
my
say the
God.
least. But I would, I don't want to talk about an article too much before it's out, but there is a lot there that is very uncomfortable and needs to be, I think, very much looked at. But I would say, for example, I here trying to think of the best tidbit to drop. So basically, Elite, its European branch was run by a guy named Gerard Marie, who was accused by a litany of women of all sorts of terrible crimes, including assault and trafficking. And he didn't go to prison for it, but a lot of women came forward, and one of the accusers of him said that she was basically set up with the weapons dealer Adnan Khashoggi, that Khashoggi paid Marie 50 grand just to meet her, and that she was pressured by him and Khashoggi into basically becoming his girlfriend when she was very, very young. And this is in the 80s. Khashoggi was allegedly, according to Vicky Ward, a client of Jeffrey Epstein's at the time, and was one of the main figures in the Iran-Contra operation, which was CIA and Israeli intelligence. And Robert Maxwell was involved in Iran-Contra, and a lot of these figures that you see in the Epstein scandal as well. So, I mean, it seems like it branches out a lot more than people would like to think, to say the least.
Yeah, I've noticed that. It's also interesting to me too. Another thing that I was looking at recently, there was a CBS this morning, and I was surprised they were the ones that aired this. They showed a different video footage view of Jeffrey Epstein's cell that was not, of course, the same footage that was released by Kash Patel in Bongino. And they showed that there was a shadowy figure walking up the steps. They said that there was more than one way to get into Jeffrey Epstein's cell. And that
Mm.
brings the question, Whitney, some people don't believe that Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Some people are saying that they believe that he's still alive,
Yeah.
but I think most of them do not believe that he took his own life. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very clear that if he did take his own life, he definitely had help in doing so, if that is the case. But frankly, I don't think anyone really knows what happened, and I don't want to sit here and be a gatekeeper telling people he's dead, he's not dead. Most people accept he's dead, and so I tend to say that. And if new evidence is presented, I'll happily accommodate that. Um, but I'm not going to like dismiss people who say he's still alive, because frankly, nobody knows. And there's been a lot of obfuscation about what went on the night that he was reportedly found dead and all of this. Um, and so, if people want to speculate that, and given, things like the intelligence ties, his ties to powerful people, and things like that, it's certainly possible. But, more often than not, I mean, cases, prominent people like Jeffrey Epstein that threaten, powerful interests with spilling the beans on things. You know, they don't want the beans to be public, basically. They can get off in prison even if they're under constant watch. So a good example of this that was in a recent article I did is this Italian man named Michele Sindona. And Michele Sindona went to prison for the collapse of a couple of banks, but it was all tied to this massive scandal involving this Freemasonic lodge in Italy that was called Propaganda Do, or P2, that was basically exposed to contain prominent business leaders, acolytes of Mussolini-style fascism in Italy, top politicians. And all sorts of very powerful figures basically meeting in secret to try and undermine and subvert the government. And they also had ties to CIA operations going on at the time, like Operation Gladio, and also had ties to organized crime, specifically the Sicilian mafia, which Luciano, who I mentioned earlier, the associate of Lansky, was deported in the World War II era, or I think maybe, or I can't remember the exact year, but around the time of the war, if not immediately after. To Italy, and got involved in that nexus as well. So Michele Sindona could have endangered a lot of powerful people. And he was under 24/7 police watch in this prison. and they were checking his food and all this stuff, and someone put cyanide in his coffee and he died in prison, despite having all of this, security to try and keep him from being killed off. He was killed off. So, uh, we don't really know, again, what happened to Epstein, but, generally in these types of cases, they do tend to get offed if they threaten to spill the beans. And it seemed like Epstein may have been willing to do that. But then again, it depends on how important of an asset he may have been. And I think that remains to be seen. So I'm happy to keep, an open mind if new evidence is presented that supports that theory. But, for reasons I just explained and past precedent about similar cases, I tend to think he died. And I don't think he did it the way the official narrative says. But I would say that he definitely had help if he did kill himself, and that there's obviously, I think, something about his death that they don't really want to come out. And I think, it would be embarrassing too, in a sense, for the first, for the current administration, because of course it was the first Trump administration when all of this happened. So it was the William Barr led Department of Justice that technically has responsibility for whatever happened to Epstein in prison.
Mm. Crazy, crazy times. There's so much that goes into this. And I think, I definitely look forward to seeing your next article. I do have a question about this as well. Many are asking if Israel was and is still blackmailing Donald Trump.
Yeah, so I don't think Israel needs to blackmail Donald Trump. Why? Because Donald Trump wouldn't exist as a business or political figure if he hadn't. And the Rothschild family has longstanding ties to the Israeli state, and also to, the popularization of Zionism in the early 20th century and slightly before then. So, he really owes that bank a lot. And Wilbur Ross, who was the banker working for N.M. Rothschild at the time Trump was bailed out, was rewarded by Trump as being his first Secretary of Commerce. Even though Wilbur Ross was like, at that point, I mean, he still is geriatric, but he was geriatric at that point too, and was falling asleep in meetings and things like that. And it's not like he was doing a good job, right? So I was widely seen as being a favor for having helped bail Trump out in the early 90s. And it's interesting how Trump sort of got involved in those issues in the first place, because in 1987, I believe, he took a controlling stake in this company called Resorts International that had been linked to organized crime interests, specifically Lansky in the Caribbean. For many, many years, and was allegedly created as some sort of CIA front involving the Dulles brothers, who had organized crime connections also. So he took a controlling stake in that and used it to sort of expand his holdings in Atlantic City, which at the time they were trying to make into the new Vegas, basically. And so, and then that same year, he buys like Adnan Khashoggi's yacht, which Adnan Khashoggi had previously used for sexual blackmail, as I note in my book. And then he starts popping up on, like, or Trump does, on Robert Maxwell's yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, taking pictures with Maxwell, a senator for the late former Senator John Tower, who was Robert Maxwell's main accomplice in his aspect of the Promise software scandal. And then Steve Ross, who I think was CEO of Time Warner at the time. And Ross basically started his company that later took over Warner Brothers, using an organized crime run company. And so there's just a lot of, obviously a cesspool of this world. And it really shouldn't be surprising that Trump would inhabit these kind of social circles, because his mentor was a man named Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn was involved in, sexual blackmail activities at the Plaza Hotel, which Trump later bought, and then later, had teamed up with elite model management of Casablancas to host Look of the Year there for a few years. And, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Sorry, a lot of pieces to keep track of here, but basically he's in this, Robert Maxwell world. And sorry, I was talking about Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn not only was involved in sort of those, sexual blackmail networks, he was also pretty much it's very easy to document, a bridge between organized crime and political power in the US. He was involved in the Nixon administration. He was involved in the Reagan administration, while also serving serving as lawyers for top mob bosses, basically.
A lot
And
of it
also
goes
being
back.
Donald Trump's lawyer and lawyer for like Studio 54 and some of these, shadier nightclubs, which is actually supposedly where Trump met Casablancas of elite models. So
A lot of it just goes back to corruption. A lot of money, money and corruption, it
well,
seems like.
money and power in New York City I mean, it obviously involves corruption, I think. If you look at it over the decades, no question there. You have to be part of a club to get in uh, to politics there for sure. And the upper echelons of power. It's, you know, you have to be part of the modern mob, basically.
Wow. Wow. This is why I look at I look at all the wealthy people with the side eye. Like, how did you get there? And speaking of wealthy people, this is in the news recently. Of course, Donald Trump has decided to take over DC, and he is saying that crime is the issue. The numbers don't show that. DC crime has actually gone down. But what was brought to my attention is this idea that Donald Trump agrees with, which is called freedom cities, which is also something that is pushed by Peter Thiel, apparently, where going back to the old days where we had company towns, where it's like, it seems like corporate takeover of
The
these
modern
towns.
version of that with programmable stable coins, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much where they're trying to take things. But I am not an expert on the freedom cities. I would encourage you to interview Ian Davis, who basically covers that beat for my site, Unlimited Hangout, and is having an upcoming piece on freedom cities and has written about some of this other stuff in a series he did all about the Tealverse, and their vision for what the government corp technique, the GovCorp technate model, which is basically, privatized government, but you're privatizing the state, but you're not you're not removing the authoritarian capacity of the state. So you're basically taking the state and then just making it a corporation, and the CEO runs it like a dictator. This is the ideology of Curtis Yarvin, sort of the house philosopher of the Peter Thiel network, who honestly, I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like during the COVID era, a lot of people were outraged by the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and you'll eat the bugs and live in a pod. And Curtis Yarvin has some quotes where he basically says that the humane alternative to genocide is to force people to live in pods and wear VR helmets and entertain them and keep them fat and comfortable. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but worth looking into the guy. He's very influential, more than you would think right now. So I think there has been kind of a concerted effort to take policies that people were outraged about, like during COVID, that were authoritarian, and sort of rebrand and repitch a lot of them as coming from the so-called libertarian right that has been financed by Peter Thiel. But Peter Thiel is not a libertarian. He likes to claim he's a libertarian, but he says, free market competition is for losers. If you want to get rich, build a monopoly. And Peter Thiel has built his monopolies with the direct involvement of three-letter agencies of the US. The most obvious being Palantir, but also when, they were creating PayPal, they went around to every three-letter agency that would talk to them. So, I mean, this is a long-standing effort with these people. And Peter Thiel, I would argue, has been honestly a social engineering genius in rebranding neoconservatism as edgy and libertarian, because libertarians used to be anti-war and now a lot of them are not.
Wow.
And you could thank Peter Thiel for that. Peter Thiel basically, so there was this program after 9/11 called Total Information Awareness, where basically they wanted to install a pre-crime system in the United States, and in order to stop terror attacks before they happen and all of this stuff, right? And it was defunded by Congress because they rightly pointed out that it would erode Americans' constitutional rights and eliminate the right to privacy entirely. And so they defunded it, but they didn't get rid of all of its programs. And then the guy that was running Total Information Awareness was this guy that was the top official in the Reagan administration, arrested for Iran-Contra, and he was pardoned by William Barr when he was Attorney General the first time. Poindexter was his last name. And so Peter Thiel and Alex Karp, when they're making Palantir, go to Poindexter, who they considered basically the godfather of surveillance, and were like, how do we remake this as a private company? And they did that with the help of Richard Pearl, who was in the Bush administration at the time, considered one of the architects of the Iraq War, who's been a longtime agent for Israel embedded in the US government. He wrote a document called, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on the name right now. That's so embarrassing. But basically, he wrote this policy document for Netanyahu when Netanyahu first came to power in the late 90s, being largely propelled into that role with the help of Ronald Lauder, an American billionaire. And the document basically said, like, we need to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and I also believe the Assad dynasty of Syria, for Israel. And so, and then previously Pearl had a lot of other very suspect ties to, the Israeli state that should have gotten him thrown out of government forever, but did not. And so this is basically how Palantir comes to be, in addition to heavy funding from the CIA through In-Q-Tel. And basically, Karp has admitted that Palantir was always intended to have the CIA basically be their main client, and that they, the CIA was their only client for their first several years of existence as a company. And Palantir engineers went to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, every 2 weeks for several years, having the CIA tweak their product. Intimately involved in this was one of the top chief information guys. I think the top executive, the CIO of the CIA, was a guy named Alan Wade, who, while he was in the CIA, co-founded a company called Gilead with Ghislaine Maxwell's sister, Christine Maxwell. So, this is basically the company that contracts for all 18 intelligence agencies and knows everything about you, according to the New York Times, and probably according to Palantir themselves. And Trump has been openly building databases on people with Palantir. Of course, most people know that they're doing that with ICE, but the administration announced not that long ago that they're doing it for everybody. And Palantir also manages all of your health data, because they contract extensively with HHS. So, this is very concerning for a lot of reasons. One point on that I would point to is how Trump in his first term, there was the spate of mass shootings, I believe, in the latter half of 2019. And Trump called on social media companies to stop shooters before they commit a crime, and to basically flag what people were saying on social media and use that to determine if there should be intervention before a crime might be committed, basically.
That's Minority Report.
Actually, William Barr, when he was in office the first time, created this program that legalized pre-crime in the United States. And I think I was like one of 2 people maybe that reported on that at the time. It was called Deep, and there's been a few arrests under Deep for people making Facebook posts and things like that. But not that many, but the legal framework has been there since, Trump round 1, basically. But anyway, this pitch that Trump made about having social media spy on its users and use like analytics to, bring about some sort of pre-crime society, he was being pitched at the time, and he was interested in it, but it didn't ultimately happen, in creating this agency called HARPA, which was supposed to be like the health version of the Pentagon's DARPA. And the program that they wanted to start with, the acronym was Safe Homes, and it was basically about analyzing American social media posts for early warning signs of neuropsychiatric violence, and then based on that, would either send people to a court-ordered psychologist or physician, or even house arrest, without them having committed any crime. So now that we have big tech even more intertwined with Trump round 2, people should really be paying attention to the stuff, especially now that Palantir, especially through the Doge formerly led by Elon Musk agency, has sort of embedded Palantir in even more aspects of the government than it was in before, including like the IRS and mortgage stuff like Fannie Mae and all of that. All have Palantir now, and then basically giving them the keys to the kingdom with a lot of data that the Department of Treasury has about your finances and the IRS and all of that. All of this is going to go into this master database. And the goal of Palantir, just like it was with total information awareness, is about stopping crime before it happens. It's pre-crime. And Palantir did that, for a few years, several years, in police departments around the country, piloting predictive policing programs, which is pre-crime, and mainly low-income minority neighborhoods, starting off in New Orleans. And now you have other companies besides Palantir that do this. There's one in LA called Predpol, and they have an accuracy of 0.5%. And they haven't gotten rid of the contract. So it's not really about better, more efficient policing. I mean, that's what it's going to be sold as. It's basically the idea that was developed by the British for prison designs in the 1800s, the panopticon, the idea that if people feel like they're constantly under watch and they could, be, well, obviously out of the prison context, you could be put in prison for doing the wrong thing or whatever, then people will police themselves. If they know they're under constant watch, they will police themselves, they will censor themselves, things of that nature. And I think ultimately that's the form of control it is about. And this is neoconservatism being framed as something else. And they've spent a lot of money with the rebrand, and I think they've been very successful. But this goes even before Bush. This goes back to the Reagan era, when they tried to create, well, they did create these programs called the continuity of government protocols where basically they could suspend Americans' constitutional rights in the event of a vaguely defined national emergency, which included, per the Reagan administration, mass nonviolent protests about a U.S. military intervention abroad. So a large anti-war protest that's nonviolent could trigger it. And so now this like liberation force that Trump has created with the Pentagon that can be deployed in the event of protests. I mean, if they decide to military intervene in Venezuela, or Iran again, and people get mad about it, these tendencies are not good. And a lot of people sort of in the MAGA media sphere being like, yeah, it's a liberation force to liberate cities from the left. But if it was the reverse and this was Biden and Biden made a liberation force to liberate cities from the right, they would be freaking out. And so in general, these trends are bad. It doesn't matter what side is implementing them. They'll be used by the other side when they're back in power. And ever since 9/11, we've had a bipartisan consensus, whether it's Bush, Obama, Biden, or Trump, to expand this apparatus in the US. Biden expanded Palantir's contracts. His DNI, Director of National Intelligence, was a Palantir advisor. And so this is something that's bipartisan, and they expand it and they grow it. The surveillance state is a bipartisan, very bad issue that people don't pay enough attention to. And, Peter Thiel is one of the main people behind it. And JD Vance is basically his political puppet. Right. And so a lot of the power that's in, Trump world now is very much adjacent to this mass surveillance agenda. And for a long time, and now it's being picked up by mainstream media, Silicon Valley has fused with the national security state. It's been going on for a very long time. And, as I've noted in a lot of my work, the national security state created a lot of the big Silicon Valley companies, or at least funded their existence and have contracted with them on and off ever since. Like Google, like Facebook, like Palantir. And so this is
It's
really the fulfillment of something that's been going on and been being built for a very long time that they really hope they don't pay attention to. And Palantir was really smart. Like I said earlier, people freaked out about total information awareness, but then they turned it into a private company. And it was like, well, the private sector can do whatever it wants, you know? Well, not if it destroys everyone's constitutional rights and contracts with the state in a public-private partnership. It's really not that functionally different at the end of the day than having it being run out of DARPA like it was originally.
That's right. It's all connected. I have one more for you, Whitney. There are many of us that saw an appearance by Ian Carroll on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he was talking about your work. And I have had this question for quite some time. Why haven't you been on to Joe Rogan's podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I've been name dropped on there by Rogan and other people and have not been invited on. And I mean, obviously, it's fine. I don't need to go on there. But I found it strange that, he would have another person on to talk about my book that's not me. Um, and I would argue, again, this is speculative, but I would argue that, the fact that I don't really like either party is very inconvenient to some large platforms. And so, instead, a person that, promoted my research, which, thanks for doing that, but that promoted my research, but their solution, unlike mine, is to vote Trump. Um, you know, I think that's more convenient. It's a more convenient package for my research than perhaps what I would say. And also in that appearance, Ian Carroll, even though he promoted my book, said that my work on Peter Thiel and Palantir was unhinged, was the term that he used. Without really explaining so. And it's kind of ironic that he would do that because for being such a big fan of my book, at the end of the book, I talk about how Palantir is the new Jeffrey Epstein. And in the age of Palantir, you do not need someone like Jeffrey Epstein or any other figure in history that engaged in sex blackmail. You don't need to do that kind of operation anymore. You can just either harvest all of the data you would need for blackmail off of people's digital devices, or you plant things on their devices that are incriminating but don't actually belong to them.
Do you think?
And Peter
Okay.
Thiel and Epstein had a significant relationship. More has come out about it, from mainstream sources in the past few months. I first wrote about their overlap in 2019. And so, it's been part of my work on Epstein for a long time, and I don't really think you can separate my work on Peter Thiel and Epstein, to be honest, because they ultimately are in service to the same end game, I would think.
A lot of it is partisan. Do you think that's why you're not on a lot of the large left YouTube shows as well? It's something I've noticed. You've been on my show, obviously Bree's show, Bad Faith. I've seen you on Katie Halper, but I noticed that people have pointed this out. They said, why isn't Whitney Webb invited on to the large left shows, the ones that have like 1 million subscribers?
I don't know. I think it might have something to do with my stance during COVID. I was very against a lot of the authoritarian policies that were implemented. I wrote a lot about, how the formation of the biosecurity state, where national security and public health have fused, the role of Palantir. I criticized, the vaccine rollout, Operation Warp Speed, having that led by the military under Trump. I mean, among other things, but I don't really know. I'm sure I have stances that bother them beyond that, And then I know, of course, that there's a particular figure on the, well, I don't even know if he's considered on the left anymore, but he doesn't like me. That would be Glenn Greenwald. I did some critical reporting back when I was on Mint Press about The Intercept, and how so many of their whistleblowers went to prison, allegedly due to reporter malfeasance. Not Greenwald specifically, but other people that were there at the time he was there. And also, wrote an article criticizing the Intercept's closure of the Snowden archives, the Snowden documents, because, less like 90% of the Snowden documents were never published. And now it's closed. So bye. And I, talked about how the owner of PayPal, Pierre Omidyar, was also the owner of The Intercept and PayPal, and also Omidyar's eBay, had longstanding connections to, intelligence world. And Pierre Omidyar was one of the most frequent visitors to the Obama White House and things like that. And Greenwald said that Omidyar had no influence on The Intercept at all at the time and really does not like me. So,
Oh my gosh. I didn't know. I didn't know.
oh,
Oh
it's
my God.
okay. I mean, I went hard at Greenwald for that because I thought he was the greatest when the Snowden stuff came out. And I found that very disappointing. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I don't really want to continue having a beef with him necessarily. And I stand by my reporting from that time. I don't think it was right what happened to Reality Winner and some of these other people that went to jail because I thought it was safe to send documents to The Intercept.
Mm. Well, I think that your work is great. I think you do a great job, and a lot of us learn quite a bit from you. I look forward to reading your next piece, which should be dropping, I believe, next week, you said?
Hopefully. I mean, snags happen. I have kind of a busy personal life right now. And also, I things are kind of crazy professionally too. So hopefully next week. But we have a lot of exciting projects coming up at Unlimited Hangout, including, a print magazine. Hope to have another book out by the end of the year, among other things. So for anyone that's interested in what's coming up from Unlimited Hangout, you can sign up for our newsletter via unlimitedhangout.com. Or, you can follow me on Twitter or whatever, but, it's best to sort of take the algorithm middleman out, especially when, they're connected to the military industrial complex as extensively as Elon Musk is. Maybe not best to have all your eggs in that basket.
Well said. Whitney Webb, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. No, my pleasure to be back.
Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.